Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. The Washington Huskies entering not only the Big Ten era, but the Jedd Fisch era heading into 2024. And one of those programs that it's just kind of fascinating to look at this depth chart and kind of project this team heading into 2024. And I'll start with this. I think, Jedd Fisch did about as good of a job as he could have done in the transfer portal, where he took over this Washington program that was going to need to go to the transfer portal regardless of Kalen DeBoer leaving or not, but took over the program late, had to get a lot of work done in the transfer portal in not a lot of time with not a lot of great selection. I think Jedd Fisch did about as good of a job as you could have done getting this roster ready heading into 2024. And I'm not going to get up here and pick Washington to win the Big Ten, make the college football playoffs, and go compete for a national championship. That being said, I think I'm significantly higher on this Washington program than a lot of people are across the national media, because you look at this roster. One, I love the coaching staff that Jedd Fisch brought in. I trust Jedd Fisch to be a great football coach as well. I think this roster, checks a lot of boxes. We certainly have some question marks that we have to dive into. When you have a veteran quarterback like Will Rogers, you're going to be in situations to win a lot of football games in 2024, at least in my opinion, one of the better quarterbacks in the conference heading into the 2024 season. Fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Washington Husky fans. It's been a blast talking this program, whether we're covering the transfer portal, what Jedd Fisch is doing on the recruiting trail. I can't thank you guys enough for rocking with the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, we're going to highlight some of the impact players for this Washington team. There are a lot of new faces. If any Washington fans have some players that I might be sleeping on that you think can be impact performers for this Washington team, please let me know in the comment section. The best part about doing these kind of preseason previews is kind of hearing from you guys and learning from you guys in the comment section. And without further ado, let's get into this one. You got to start with Will Rogers. Again, you look at the landscape of the Big Ten outside of Dillon Gabriel at Oregon. What quarterback is more proven than Will Rogers heading into the 2024 season in the Big Ten Conference? I think the answer is none of them. You look at Will Rogers, over 12,000 passing yards in the SEC, 94 touchdowns to only 28 interceptions, a 69% completion percentage. Will Rogers knows how to play winning football. And you're putting him in an offense with Jedd Fisch that I think kind of fits what Will Rogers wants to do. Look, we know Will Rogers is not going to go top 10 in the NFL draft. That being said, we know Will Rogers is going to get the football out quickly, on time, to places it needs to go. That's kind of what Jedd Fisch's offense is built on. We're going to spread you out. We're going to get our playmakers the football in space. We just need a point guard of this offense. Will Rogers, with all the experience that he has, I think is perfectly suitable for this Jedd Fisch, Brennan Carroll offense. And I think on top of that, I am, really starting to lean into these 5th, 6-year quarterbacks. We've seen them have a lot of success, right? Bo Nix, Michael Penix, quarterbacks that just have played a lot of football, have seen a lot of defenses. We are starting to see them have a lot of success at the college football level. So going into 2024, I'm a believer in Will Rogers, the most important position on the football field, especially in the landscape of the Big Ten. I think when you're looking at this Washington offense, the next question mark you have to go to is the offensive line. I look at the running back position and say Jonah Coleman's one of my favorite running backs, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. The Washington fans who've been rocking with the boys the last couple of weeks and months know I'm a massive Jonah Coleman fan. You look at the wide receiver position, Denzel Boston, breakout year. Jeremiah Hunter coming from Cal. He put up phenomenal numbers in a Cal offense that kind of stunk. Now, I think the X factor in this Washington offense is Giles Jackson, who we all know can be an elite playmaker with the football in his hands. As a Michigan fan myself, I know a lot about Giles Jackson. We just haven't necessarily seen him a ton consistently on the football field. Giles Jackson is one of those players that I think fits exactly what Jedd Fisch wants to do, right? We talked about getting the football out quickly, 2-year playmakers, letting them operate after the catch. That is the prototypical offense that you want Giles Jackson to play in. And so I look at Giles Jackson and say we might be talking about Giles Jackson playing a massive role in this Washington offense in the 2024 year. So you look at this offense and say, all right, we're checking the box at the quarterback spot. We're checking the box at the running back spot. I think the wide receiver room is a lot better than people think because they lose all those guys to the NFL. I think you still have some really good football players in that room. I think the one question mark is, how does that offensive line come together? Now, Jedd Fisch went to the transfer portal extremely heavy to kind of, just get some competitive depth in that offensive line room. And I think you have a couple of guaranteed starters, but I think largely you're not necessarily sure how the offensive line plays out. Couple of things to be optimistic about. One, Jedd Fisch and that offensive staff at Arizona, largely the same staff that he brought to Washington, they did a phenomenal job revamping that Arizona offensive line. An offensive line at Arizona that historically was one of the worst, if not the worst in the conference. You take a look back at the 2023 and even the 2022 season, and Arizona started to put it together on the offensive line. I think the big question is, how quickly does it come together for Washington? That probably is the answer to how good this Washington team can be. You go to the transfer portal, you're bringing a guy like Drew Azzopardi, who is, probably the most proven offensive lineman on this Washington offensive line at the right tackle spot, coming from San Diego State. You're bringing a guy like Enoch Viami, who's going to, I believe, his 7th year of college football, coming from Ohio State, formerly a very coveted recruit coming out of high school. Can he kind of put it together? He's been at the college football landscape for a long time, which makes you feel decent that he's going to be solid. You look at D'Angelo Tiatali at the center position, a guy that's played a lot of football coming from Portland State. I look at the offensive line and say, all right, you have some young guys that you didn't see for Washington last year because all the veterans were playing that certainly could push for starting spots, but you also bring in a lot of veteran talent in the transfer portal that you kind of just know are going to be solid football players for Washington. So I think the big question mark for this offense, you got a really good play caller in Jedd Fisch and Coach Carroll. You got a really good quarterback, running back, and wide receivers. How much does this offensive line come together specifically when you're playing some of those elite Big Ten defenses with really good defensive lines? That's probably going to be the question for Washington on the offensive side of the football. You go to the defensive side of the football, and again, it is a ton of new faces, specifically along the line of scrimmage. I think the big storyline and talking point here is Steve Belichick coming in as the defensive coordinator, where there is a track record for defensive coaches from the NFL coming to college and kind of lighting the world on fire, right? Michigan had a ton of success going to the NFL and hiring defensive guys. You look at Danton Lynn at UCLA, it makes me kind of optimistic that Steve Belichick can come in and have a really good defense for this Washington program in the 2024 season. You start on the defensive line. I think they did a really good job addressing some of the depth, right? You're bringing some guys from Arizona. You bring in a guy like Jaden Wayne from Miami, who was former top 100 national prospect. You have Sebastian Valdez coming in on the inside. Zach Durfee was getting a ton of buzz before he was ruled ineligible to play in the 2023 season. Isaiah Ward coming from Arizona. It's kind of a mixed bag. Not a ton of guys that we've seen at the Power 5 level. That being said, there's some names that you kind of feel comfortable about. But then once again, kind of like we talked about on the offensive line, there's some competitive depth. I mean, there's a lot of players that could emerge as starters for this Washington defensive line. I think, again, the question is, how good can they be in 2024? You look at the linebacker room, I am a really big fan of what these starting linebackers are, especially a guy like Carson Bruner. But both Alfonso and Carson, they've played a ton of football at the linebacker spot. We all know that's really important at the linebacker position where, yes, you want to be physically gifted at the linebacker spot, but more importantly, you want to have those instincts. You want to have linebackers that know what they're doing. Both Carson and Alfonso have played a ton of football during their college football careers, have been at the college football landscape for quite a long time. It makes you feel pretty good that linebacker room is going to be pretty good. Then you go to the secondary. You're bringing a couple guys that I'm massive fans of. One, Justin Harrington, coming over from Oklahoma, was the starting nickelback for Oklahoma for the 2 games before he got hurt. I mean, Justin Harrington, again, a guy that is going into, I believe, his 7th year at the college football landscape, a guy that we think can play. You look at Efesien's Prysock, one of the better cornerbacks that we'll see in the Big Ten. You're going to see Steve Belichick play a lot of press man coverage. I think that fits exactly what Efesien's Prysock wants to do as a boundary corner who has a ton of length in the arms, wants to put hands on wide receivers. I don't know if this defense will be a top 15 defense in the country because, again, we're kind of waiting and seeing on how good that defensive line is going to be. That being said, in the back seven, the linebackers and secondary, you feel pretty good. I would highlight a guy like Cameron Broussard, who was a Michigan target. You guys know I'm a Michigan fan. I would have loved to see Michigan go out and get Cameron Broussard because he can play in a lot of different spots. And you talk about that Steve Belichick defense that wants to be very multiple and versatile. And Cameron Broussard can play the free safety spot. He can play the nickel spot. He can come up in the box and give you run support. He can come off the edge as a blitzer. So many different ways that you can use him. There was a reason that Washington wanted him in the transfer portal because he fits what they want to do on the defensive side of the football. You look at the depth chart and say, again, we have question marks along the line of scrimmage. If the line of scrimmage play comes together, and again, we're not saying the offensive line or defensive line is going to be a top 10 unit in the country. The offensive line is certainly not going to win the Joe Moore Award like it did last year. But if it can just be solid, I think the rest of the roster for Washington is pretty dang good heading into 2024. And I think the next fascinating conversation is you look at the schedule for Washington, massive 5 games. And I think there's a very good chance that Washington can go 5-0. Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern. You get 3 out of the 4 games at home. The only road game essentially is Washington State, which is not a hard travel game. You look at the first 4 games and say, you kind of think Washington can go 4-0 in those games. I think that really interesting game is going across the country to Piscataway in New Jersey, where, look, I think Washington has the better skill on the outside. You look at how Rutgers wants to play football. It's going to be a line of scrimmage team. We kind of call them the poor man's Michigan of the Big Ten. Can Washington hang with Rutgers on the line of scrimmage? Because if they can, I think they're much more talented on the outside at the skilled positions. Washington certainly can go on the road and beat that Rutgers team. Then you go to Michigan. You get Michigan at home. As a Michigan fan, I am very close to buying tickets to come out and watch that game. I've heard from a lot of people that there's not a better place to watch a football game than at Husky Stadium. I'm probably not going to pick Washington to win that game. Then you go on the road to Kinnick Stadium in Iowa City, kind of a mixed match where Washington's going to be able to put on some points. We're not really sure what the Iowa offense is going to be. That's a toss-up game in my opinion because Iowa's just not going to be able to score much more than 24 points. Jedd Fisch, I like his ability to score 24 points in that game. I'm not necessarily picking Washington to go on the road and beat Iowa. That being said, I think certainly a game where they can win. You go on the road to Indiana, I think they can win that game. You get USC at home. I think that's a toss-up game, but you get them at home. On the road at Penn State. Hard to pick Washington there because I do think Penn State will be very good along the line of scrimmage. UCLA, then off week, then on the road at Oregon. Love having the bye week before that Oregon game. I look at Oregon, Penn State, Michigan. Those are probably the only 3 games that I'm picking against Washington. USC has a lot of question marks. We'll kind of see what they look like. We'll kind of have a good feel for what USC is going to be come November 2nd. I think Washington has a very good chance in a lot of these football games. So again, am I picking Washington to go 10-2, make the Big Ten championship and the college football playoffs? Probably not, but I think they're going to be a lot more competitive than a lot of people think in the Big Ten. I think that's what's fascinating about this Washington team, because you look at Jedd Fisch and what he's doing on the recruiting trail, what he's shown he can do in the transfer portal. Jedd Fisch is going to reload this roster. I don't know if it's all going to come together in the 2024 year, but if you're a Washington fan kind of projecting to 2025 and 2026, I think there's a lot of reasons to have confidence in this Washington program getting back to kind of a year-in, year-out competitor in the Big Ten. I think a fascinating team. Really excited to watch this team in 2024. A lot of fun game predictions to do. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.